Okay, so this is the practical work for session 3. We're going to be making a wax registration rim on a model like this. We're going to use a shellac base plate for this exercise. We can make the base out of either this material shellac or just out of wax with a wire strengthener in, or we can make a light cured base from the same material that we use for the special trays. And of course we could make the definitive base out of heat cured acrylic if we wish, and then build the wax registration rim on top of that. So here we've got the shellac, thermoplastic material. Warm it up gently using a flame like so. Turn a Bunsen upside down, or gently use a microtorch like this. And we need to heat soak the material all the way through, so it's going to be nice and soft without burning on the surface. So gently heating, you can see it's starting to go a little bit shiny and drooping into the palette. And then if you dab your fingers in a bit of water or use a bit of dental gauze, you can ease the material down into the palette. So hold it down in the midline to start with. And then we can take it up and over the alveolar ridge. We're just going over the crest of the alveolar ridge. We're not going all the way down into the sulcus with this material. The sulcus will be made up from wax rather than from this hard material, and that's because this is not so easy to adjust and trim in the clinic, so we tend to make the periphery where adjustment might be required out of wax. I'm just giving it an extra warm there because it's not quite adapted as well as I'd like to the model. You should be able to see the detail of the model through the shellac material. Okay, so once you're happy with the fit of the shellac base across the palette and up and over the crest of the alveolar ridge, we can take a wax knife and heat it in an induction burner or in a Bunsen flame. It needs to be quite hot, and we're going to cut all the way through, well, almost all the way through the shellac base where we want it to end, which is just over the crest of the alveolar ridge. Try to keep your knife clean as you're doing this, so once you've made your cuts, give it a wipe, get rid of that shellac, otherwise you find that when you put it back in the Bunsen or in the induction heater it just burns and discolours. And once you've cut through, as the material cools down, it should just snap away if you've cut far enough through. And then this is where we're going to end the wax approximately as we come palatally. You might just come over this line just to blend it all in, but it'll give you an idea. And then we can just put some retention where we want the wax to attach onto the shellac base plate. So again, just a hot wax knife, just work your way around quite quickly, just pop in some little notches, grooves, cuts into the top of the shellac over the crest of the ridge, and that'll just allow the wax to attach on more securely. If we know we haven't got much space for the teeth, we probably wouldn't want to bring the shellac all the way over like this. We'd make the rim with a wax base plate to make it easier to set the teeth at the next stage. So now we want to put the sulcus onto the base plate to finish off the base of this wax registration rim. So I'm taking a sheet of wax and I'm just warming it here over a microtorch. I'd normally do this over a Bunsen, but our gas isn't working, so we're using a microtorch, not quite so easy because it's a very small flame. So what you're aiming to do is to make a roll of wax about as thick as your little finger, something like that, and it wants to be nice and soft all the way through, so it's going to be easy to adapt into the sulcus. Your model needs to be slightly damp so that the wax doesn't stick to the model, and then with your finger and thumb use all your strength to push that wax into the sulcus and adapt it firmly to the shellac base. You can see I'm just holding the shellac base in place while I'm doing it, and then pushing the wax into the sulcus onto the shellac base, so we get a really good reproduction of the model onto the fitting surface of the wax registration rim. Something like this. You can see that I've just gone over the land edge, the land area of the model a little, so with a nice clean knife, warm it slightly, and you can just cut that back at this stage. Just tidy up as you go, and then hopefully you've got all your landmarks and reference points for the next stages so that it doesn't get out of control and become a mess. So just peel that wax off, and then at this stage, once the wax has cooled down, it's a good idea to just try and take it off the model to make sure it comes off before you start adding the wax block. So here I've got a wax block warmed in some water, which just allows us to shape it to the arch form, and you can just try it over the model. Remember that we're aiming to get the block centered over the alveolar ridge, particularly at the posterior. At the front we want to be just slightly forward, so the labial surface of the block should be 7 or 8 millimeters or so in front of the incisive papilla. If you've got Alma gauge readings, you can work to the Alma gauge readings. If not, we'll just use the incisive papilla as our reference point and put that labial surface anterior to it. So once you've got it shaped to the arch form, you can just dry it off, and then we just need to attach it. So to do that, we'll just soften the surface of the wax, soften the underneath of the rim, and attach the two together. When I was shaping the wax block, you probably saw that I turned the model over and pressed it against the bench, so the underneath of the wax block fits against the alveolar quite snugly. You'll see there is a bit of a gap. I'm just checking that the labial surface is lined up where I want it, and the rim's over the top of the arch. You'll see that there is a bit of a gap between the rim surface and the base. So I'll need to fill that up with a little bit of additional wax. I was just cleaning my knife. Rarely do we need the material that's over the top of the tuberosities. On dentures, certainly here in the hospital, we tend not to put the second molars on, the sevens on anyway. With your wax registration rims, when you're carrying out the registration procedure clinically, it's quite difficult to see right at the back of the mouth sometimes, and also they're the areas that are likely to contact first if the blocks are made too high, and they'll unseat the blocks. So we can cut them a little bit shorter than you may imagine, so anterior to the tuberosities, and it gives us less work to do as well at this stage. And then we can use the other end of the wax knife, and you can see I'm getting it nice and hot, and I'm just softening the surface of the wax and just letting that wax flow onto the shellac base plate and letting it cool down, and that'll make a nice smooth transition between the base plate and the wax rim. And then we're going to do the same on the buccal and labial surfaces. So you just have to do a small area, or one side, the buccal on one side, and let it cool down, and then you can turn it and do the other side. And this is hopefully filling some of that void in between the block and the base plate that I've got in the anterior portion of mine as well. So the secret really to getting a nice finish on these is to avoid any air being trapped in the wax. That makes them look speckled or a mottled appearance. And you want to make sure that you've got a nice hot wax knife and it's clean, so that when you're running round the surface of the wax with the spoon end of the knife. It's going to melt just the surface, and then as it cools and solidifies, it'll be a nice flat smooth surface. Here where I've got that void in between the block and the base, I'm just taking some additional wax either from a spare bit of block or from one of the sheets of wax, and I'm just filling that gap. Because we've done the palatal aspect first, the wax shouldn't run all the way through, as long as it's cooled down and solidified. So just gradually filling it in. You can see it's just starting to run out that side a little bit. I'm getting a bit too enthusiastic, a bit keen. Just let your wax cool down a bit before you add any more. Okay, so that's just about full now, and when that cools down a little, we can use the spoon end of the knife again just to run around the whole lot and make a nice smooth surface all the way around, which we can record our information on in the clinic, so our centre lines and smile lines and so on. We've got a blank canvas to work from. With regards dimensions of these registration rims, the block, the width of the rim in the posterior region wants to be about that of a molar tooth, and it can be narrowed slightly in the anterior region as long as the labial surface is in the correct position, then that's okay. Here I'm just showing that the wax has been adapted nicely down into the sulcus all the way around. Just where I trimmed the wax off, where it was extending over the land area of the model, I'm just going to take my knife and just blend it in slightly, just so there's no sharp or rough edges. We'll do that all the way around. Same on the other side. Just letting a little air bubble out. Okay, so the rim wants to be about 22 or so millimeters high from the labial sulcus to the incisal edge of the rim. It's about, so you don't have to be massively precise, but put a mark at the 22 millimeter point, and then we just want to level up the occlusal plane across the arch and as we go back in the mouth. So that's the incisal plane angle across the arch, so we want to be making that parallel to the interpupillary line, so parallel to the eyes. So we approximate that at this stage by using an occlusal plane inclinator, and this also gives us a good approximation of the occlusal plane as we go back in the mouth, anterior posteriorly. And you can see it's got a little lip on the back of this metal plate, and that sits across the back of the model, and we keep that in contact with the model, and with it nice and hot we fold the metal plate down, keeping that lip in contact with the back of the model, like so. You can see we're melting the wax preferentially from the posterior part of the rim, and we keep going until we get to that 22 millimeter mark that we measured, and this is setting the occlusal plane from front to back, anterior to posterior of the mouth. So when we look at the block in the mouth or a denture in the mouth, we should see that the occlusal surfaces of the upper teeth are disappearing off up into the tuberosity area. And because we're using the model as well with that lip on the hot plate, it'll keep the block level across the arch as well, so the incisal plane. We can just remove a bit of this material here over the tuberosities, and then pretty much that's the bulk of the block done. Now it's just a case of tidying it up and making it look presentable. Here I'm just going to narrow the width of the rim in the anterior region on the palatal aspects, just to allow a little bit more space for the tongue. So we can have that quite thin at the front. The only problem if we go too thin is, of course, it's not going to be robust enough to survive the registration process, but it's that labial surface that we're really interested in. And now it's the case of just giving it a finish off and making it look smooth and tidy, make sure there's no scrappy bits of wax on the surface. So we give it a run round with a hot knife like so. And then people have all sorts of ways of finishing off wax to make it look polished and presentable. Here I'm just going around the back edge where we're blending the wax into the shellac base plate. Make sure it's a nice clean edge. So as I say, people have different ways of finishing off the wax. We can simply get some cold water and a bit of cotton wool or some dental gauze, and this has got a bit of soap in it, and that'll just cool the wax down and polish the wax up so it's nice and shiny and looks presentable. And then that just wants rinsing off and disinfecting. Just blowing it with the airline here just so you can see. Alternatively, we can take a gas torch and flame the surface of the wax. Some people will take some solvent, so some orange solvent, which just melts the surface of the wax very slightly. I'm just drying this off. So we can take a flame and just flame the surface, and that just puts a nice finish on the wax as well. And then do the same again. Some cold water and a bit of soap on some cotton wool or some dental gauze, and just polish up the surface of the wax. Either way, it wants to look presentable. It wants to be nice and smooth, and it wants to be shaped so that it's going to support the top lip and so on. Okay, and of course we'd make a lower rim pretty much in the same way to go with it. So a lower rim, it wants to be sighted over the alveolar ridge again. Likewise at the front, make the lower rim about 18mm tall. Okay, we'll see you in the lab.